Welcome. Today we're going to continue looking at the idea of leaving a church and are there good reasons to leave? Well, there are good reasons to leave, but a lot of times the reasons that people have in leaving are not good reasons. Today we're going to look at whether or not leaving because a church takes a bad decision is a good reason to leave. Should we leave because of bad decisions? So a lot of times people will leave because they disagree with a decision that the church made. Perhaps they feel like they were not listened to. They just don't like the reasoning behind the decision. They just don't think it's the right decision, that it's the best way to do something. And so they pack their bags and they go. Before we get into whether that is a good thing to do or not, let's just remember about the letters to the churches in Asia that Jesus writes in the book of Revelation. At Pergamos, they had false teachers. They made the decision to allow the false teachers to teach those things there. That was a very bad decision, and Jesus was not happy with it. In Thyatira, there was a false prophetess called Jezebel, and she taught the Christians to commit fornication and eat food sacrificed to idols. And the church made the decision to tolerate her, and that was a terrible decision. But in both cases, Jesus never even suggested that the faithful should leave, and he indicated that there were faithful Christians in these churches. So if you can continue being faithful yourself while being in the congregation where you are, even if they make a bad decision, well, you should probably stay there according to the reasoning or the thinking that we find in the scriptures. You'll have to find some sort of scriptural reason for leaving, otherwise that's not just an excuse, but is the actual reasoning behind why you leave. So one thing that we should look at when we talk about this is that decision that you disagree with just a decision that you don't like? That might be something about the church building. Church buildings have caused a lot of trouble among Christians and churches throughout the years. In many places, churches have divided over what decisions were made about the church building. Now, you can make sinful decisions about a church building, but a lot of times it's not a sinful decision, it's just a decision that people strongly disagree with the wisdom of, and they leave over that. Or it could be a decision about who's going to preach for the church there. Sometimes when a preacher is asked to leave by the church, then people will leave with the preacher because they have loyalty to that preacher and are not loyal to their other brethren in the church. They're not treating that church like the body and the family that God intends it to be. Sometimes they're not happy about the preacher that's invited to preach. I know of a case where the church had a meeting and they invited someone who had not withdrawn fellowship from a false teacher. And they decided that they should leave the church because the church invited this person who was not a false teacher, but they invited him to come and preach there, and he had not withdrawn fellowship from his friend who was a false teacher about divorce and remarriage. And that's another reason people leave. They disagree with that type of decision. Sometimes it's a decision about who should not be an elder in the church. Well, there are some times where people disagree about who should be an elder, and someone who's clearly not qualified is appointed. But I'm talking about where they think someone should be appointed an elder, but the rest of the church does not agree, and they are not appointed an elder. I've known places where people have left because they or a family member of theirs was not appointed an elder when they thought that they should be. There can be decisions about when the church should meet. If the church decides, you know what, we've been meeting on Sunday morning and Sunday evening, but we're going to start meeting only once. Well, is that sinful? It could be a sinful decision based on the reasoning behind it, but it can be a perfectly good decision as well. But you're going to have members who don't like it, almost certainly. But should they leave about that simply because they don't like that decision? So if we leave over things like this, where we don't like the decision, but it's not a sinful decision, at least not in itself, we need to really carefully examine whether it's pride that's behind that decision. And ask the question, would Jesus really be happy if we left over this? Because it's not about us. It's about the body of Christ. It's about our fellowship with His people. Is He happy that we're leaving His people over this? Sometimes, or maybe very often, pride is a motive in leaving a church. It could be we're demanding our own way, insisting that we are always right. When we think about the 7 things that the Lord hates that we talked about recently, it all culminated, it came down to the one who causes division. That's what the other sins lead to. And what's the first thing on the list? It's the haughty eyes or a prideful look. Pride very often leads to division. Sometimes our pride says that we should leave so that we don't have to have our arguments dismissed by our brethren. Our pride is offended because people aren't listening to us. They're not convinced by our arguments. Maybe they're not even paying that much attention to them. And that hurts our pride. So we say, well, if that's how they're going to treat me, then I'm just going to leave. Well, that's pride, and it's sinful. Sometimes pride says that we should leave because we're worried about what others in other places will think of us. Since we're part of the church that has made this decision that can be regarded as foolish or that we think is foolish. And we're concerned, well, our friends and our brethren in other places are going to be questioning us. Why is the church there doing this? Well, the way you handle that is, well, that's the decision the church made. I disagreed with it, but that's the decision. That's how we're going to do it because that's how we decided. Not everybody is going to agree with most decisions that a church makes, even if it's just what time the church should meet to worship. There's probably people who wish it would be earlier, some that wish it would be later. It's not a reason to leave just because the church doesn't go the way we would like it to go. In Titus 3, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to obey, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. For we ourselves were also once foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another." Well, we're not supposed to continue like that. That's how we used to be. Now we're to be subject to rulers and authorities. Whether we have elders in the church, we should submit to them, or whether it's the men of the congregation as a whole taking a decision, we need to submit to that decision. Obviously, as long as we can be faithful in submitting to that decision and be humble towards all men and not allow pride to get in the way. Down in verse 8 through 11, it says, "This is a faithful saying, and these things I want you to affirm constantly, that those who have believed in God should be careful to maintain good works. These things are good and profitable to men, but avoid foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and useless. Reject a divisive man after the first and second admonition, knowing that such a person is warped and sinning, being self-condemned." A dispute over something that is not sinful is a foolish dispute. We should not be arguing about these things. We can talk about them, we can give our reasoning for why we think something is better than another, but in the end, we must not be divisive, we must not be having foolish disputes, we must be subject to all and have humility towards all. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, when love is described, it says, "Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Do you notice here that if we have love towards our brethren, towards the church that we are part of, we are going to be patient, suffer long. We are not going to have pride. We're not puffed up. We're not going to demand that the way we think things should be done are done as the church. We don't seek our own. We're not going to become easily upset and angry to walk away because of something that is decided, because love is not provoked. We're not going to be happy with everything, but we're going to bear all things, and we're going to endure all things. We're going to work through these problems, work through the things that we don't like, because we love one another. If we have true love towards one another, it's very rare that anybody is going to leave the congregation. In Titus chapter 1, in verses 7 through 9, describing a bishop or an elder or pastor, it says, "For a bishop must be blameless as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, holy, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able, by sound doctrine, both to exhort and convict those who contradict." So when we're talking about a disagreement, certainly those who contradict the word of God should be corrected. That's not a foolish dispute. All of us, not just bishops, we need to be growing to where we can do that. But bishops are those who set the example. They are already there. They can do that. They're self-controlled. That means they're not going to lose their temper because a decision is taken that they don't like. Even when there are elders, not all the elders may be very happy with the decisions that are made because you don't have just one elder. So they have to figure out how to make decisions together, just like when there's a business meeting of all the men, when there's no elders. It's just you don't have quite as many different ideas to deal with. But they're not self-willed, and that's the main thing I want us to see. This is something that is very important for an elder or a bishop, that they're not insisting on their own way. They're making decisions that are going to be good for everybody, and that means sometimes deciding things that may be not exactly what they prefer, may not be the way that they would do it, but it turns out that others think differently, and so they make a decision not based on their own self-will, but on thinking about others. And that's the example that all the rest of us are supposed to follow. We are not supposed to be self-willed. We're not to seek our own. But then we have to ask ourselves, is it a sinful decision? Is it not just a decision that I don't like, but is it a decision that God disagrees with, that he hates? Refusing to discipline a sinner, like Jezebel and Thyatira, was clearly something God disapproved of. Jesus condemned that, but they didn't have to leave because of that, even though it was a sinful decision that the church made. In 3 John verses 9 and 10, we read about a man named Diotrephes, who put faithful brethren out of the church. And John says if he comes, he's going to deal with Diotrephes. Diotrephes was kind of running the church there. He was making sinful decisions. He wanted the preeminence. He wanted everyone to look up to him. And so he wouldn't even accept faithful brethren coming in. If you were part of the church there, that would be very difficult to deal with. But you would have to be faithful anyway, and eventually you would actually be put out of the church, is the idea that we read there. At least that's the idea that I get. I might not have a complete understanding of it, but it seems like the faithful brethren there did not leave the church, but rather were put out of the church by Diotrephes. It could be that when clearly unqualified men, people who, there's no question whether they're qualified or not, they're just not, that when they're appointed as elders, that's obviously a sinful decision that the church has taken. In fact, it's a sinful decision that an evangelist has taken to appoint them as elders, because it's the evangelist's responsibility to do the appointing. But it is something that is not good. I don't believe that that means someone has to leave that church, however, because they can still remain faithful even then. It may be that the church decides to use its money for something Christ does not want the church doing, whether that's supporting a school or whether that is having a soccer team or whatever it may be that is clearly not from Christ. It's not in his teaching. Well, that's a sinful decision. Can you remain there while being faithful? Well, that one's a bit difficult. And I think it would be very hard to remain in a church that makes that decision and be faithful, because generally you're going to be contributing to the contribution, and that's being used by the church for these sinful things. It could be that the church decides to worship God in ways he doesn't want, such as using instrumental music in worship. Well, you can't possibly stay there, can you, and be faithful, because you would have to participate in that sinful worship. And so that would be a case where you actually have to leave. But in a lot of these cases, we don't have to leave, even though it's a sinful decision being taken. We know in Thyatira, refusing to discipline a sinner was not a reason to leave. When we look at some of these, it may not be that clear, but we need to think these things through very carefully and never jump to the conclusion that we ought to walk away from our family, from the church where we are. If you can be faithful while being part of that church, you do not have to leave. I think that is the basic principle here. Now, does that mean you cannot leave? That's another question that's a little bit harder to answer. If you think that staying there is going to be detrimental to your family's spiritual welfare and that sort of thing, those are things you have to think through. But it could be that walking away is detrimental to your family's spiritual welfare as well, maybe more so. And if you stay and show love and patience, your family is going to grow from that. And it's actually going to be much better for them when you do things the way God intends for us to do them. So is it ever right to leave over a sinful decision? Well, yes, there are. There are some things the church can decide to do that do not allow the members to be faithful, where you cannot remain there and be faithful as a Christian, be faithful to Christ. Instrumental music is one of those. Many Christians were forced to leave churches where they were able to be faithful before, but once they made the decision, we're going to have instrumental music, no matter what anybody here thinks about it, people had to leave in order to worship God in a faithful way. When we talk about the use of the church's treasury, if they're using it consistently for things that are not part of Christ's plan for his church, it seems like a lot of people are forced to leave about that. Now, I know people who continue in churches like that. They just don't contribute to the collection. They use their money in other ways that God wants them to. They contribute to congregations in other places that are faithful to Christ and how they use the collection. I know Christians like that, and I'm not going to condemn them for that. I honestly just don't know what is the best thing to do in that type of situation, especially if you don't have somewhere else that you can go that's faithful. Yes, I know you can start a new congregation, but that's often not the best solution. Often the best solution is to try to be patient and loving and help the brethren where you are see the truth about what Christ has taught. So is it right to leave because you disagree with the decision that the church has taken? Well, if it's a decision that is not something God clearly disagrees with, then I would say, yeah, it's wrong to leave for that reason. If it's just pride, essentially, that is why you're leaving in that case. If it's a decision that God disagrees with, but you can still be faithful, even though the church took that decision, such as refusing to discipline someone that should be disciplined, the scriptures, as far as I can see, indicate it would be wrong to leave. And you can study that deeper and see if you have something you can share with me more on that, but it doesn't look like there's any reason to leave there, any good reason to leave in that type of situation. If it's a decision that God disagrees with, but you cannot be faithful if you continue to be part of the church there, then we have to reach the conclusion that that's the time to leave the church. It's when you cannot be faithful to God and be part of that church. That's true if it's a church that teaches a false gospel where the people aren't even children of God. Well, you can't be faithful and be joined together with them. But in a church where people have been baptized into Christ, have had their sins forgiven, they are added to his kingdom, and now they're not being faithful. But you can be faithful as you try to help them grow as your brethren. You can stay there. But it's when you cannot be faithful anymore because of the decisions that the church has taken, that's the time to leave. And it's not something we should ever want to do, but it can be a necessity at times. I hope that's helpful. I hope you can think through that. And if you disagree with me about any of this, please let me know and explain why you disagree. Thanks very much.